So for many decades in New Zealand, there's been a reasonably clear separation between political leadership, that being ministers who are responsible for policy, directions, political management, and administrative leadership, the civil service, in terms of having responsibility for the management of departments, the hiring of staff. So for a long time there's been that understanding of the separation of roles.
Iain Rennie has over 35 years of experience working on a wide range of economic policy and public management issues, both inside government and as a consultant. After graduating from Victoria University of Wellington, the focus of his career has been working on major institutional reforms in public management systems and fiscal policy decision-making. He works with a range of clients which includes international organizations, sovereign governments, and individual public sector agencies. He provides strategic guidance and evidence-based insights on matters relating to civil service reform, public financial management design, public policy formation, governance and entity reviews, and leadership with complex environments. Prior to working as an independent consultant, Iain worked in the New Zealand Public Service for 30 years, working across the three central agencies: the Treasury, State Service Commission, and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, or DPMC. He joins us today on our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Welcome, Iain Rennie, to Advocata Conversation. I remember seeing your Prime Minister once saying that New Zealand has no snakes. Sri Lanka has lots of snakes. Is that correct?
That's right. No poisonous, no snakes at all.
Right. And was it always there?
Yeah, we've never had snakes.
You've never had snakes. Okay, interesting. You're very lucky on that, because I hate snakes. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about your story.
So I was born in New Zealand. My parents migrated to New Zealand. They both came from the United Kingdom. So I'm an immigrant, and I studied economics at university. Because when I was a young person and thinking about what to do, it was a time of economic reform. So economics was very interesting, and so I studied economics. And then when I finished my degree, I went and worked at the New Zealand Treasury, and that was a time of big economic reform in New Zealand. So there was big tax reform. There was the creation of state-owned enterprises, of privatisation, a move to inflation targeting, which is one of the relatively early pieces of work that I worked on. So it was a very exciting time for a young person interested in economic reform to get started.
And what attracted you initially to do economics?
I think when I was growing up and began to have a sense about the world around me, I became aware that New Zealand was not doing well. You know, people were losing their jobs. People were leaving the country. There was a sense that people were less well off. The country wasn't succeeding. And so I found economics a way to think about those issues, and also to look at were there ways to make the country better. And that sense of improvement and reform is something that I had when I was a teenager, and I've still got it today.
Perhaps we share a mutual interest. So your country went through a large crisis in the mid-70s. Can you, for the benefit of our viewers, can you tell us what precipitated it and what really happened?
Prior to the 1970s, New Zealand had been able to underwrite high incomes for New Zealanders through the success of a small number of agricultural export industries, through wool, lamb, dairy. But in the 1970s, the world economy turned against New Zealand. The price of oil and a lot of imports rose a lot faster than the price of our exports. There was a shift away from some of our products. So instead of people buying wall carpets. They bought carpets made from synthetic products. We had a guaranteed market into the United Kingdom. That market became more difficult to access when the UK moved into what was subsequently called the European Union. So there were a range of changes that were happening. And initially, the response of both officials and policymakers was to try and protect New Zealand from those changes, to use fiscal and monetary policy to offset the negative impacts. But it became clear as time went by that these weren't short-term changes. They weren't going to go away. They were fundamental changes. And that then prompted quite a long period of time about, well, what was, if you like, how did New Zealand position itself in the world in the future? And that process was one of initial reform starting in the mid-1970s, but governments found it hard to stay the course, so they slid back. We let inflation run for over 15% for over a decade. Our fiscal position, which was in surplus at the beginning of the 1970s, by the middle of the 1980s, we were running a deficit of 9% of GDP. Many New Zealanders were leaving New Zealand. New Zealanders can live and work in Australia by right, and many people were seeing better futures. So there was a sense of crisis, and in the mid-1980s, there was a change of government, and that government had to devalue by 20% overnight. And there were then a series of reforms that government and then its successor put in place over basically a decade. And in large measure, those reforms have been sustained and continued over the last 30 years or so with relatively minor amendments.
And what happened during the crisis? So was it a currency crisis, or how did it precipitate itself?
There was essentially a currency crisis. There was an outflow of capital. Foreign reserves ran down. This was all happening in the context of an election campaign, which the then government lost. But the outgoing Prime Minister then created a political crisis because he refused to devalue, and he refused to take the advice of the incoming government initially to devalue. And so there was both a sort of, if you like, an economic and a political crisis. But ultimately, the decision was made to devalue, and off the back of that, a whole series of reforms were started.
So there was a change in government, and there was a significant devaluation. It was a fixed exchange rate?
It had been a fixed exchange rate. So initially there was a move of the fixed exchange rate down by 20%. And then about 9 months later, New Zealand moved from a fixed exchange rate system to a floating exchange rate, which has continued since.
So there was a change of government, and what were the kind of changes that were made?
So part of the change of government was there was generational change. So you'd had previously ministers who'd grown up in the context of the Great Depression, whose responses were very much to protect. The new set of ministers were generally somewhat younger. They'd grown up in the 60s and 70s. They had a different view of the world. So they had a view that the private sector had more to offer in terms of managing the economy, that the private sector could actually do better in many areas, particularly around services that could be commercialized and sold. There was less of a commitment for the state to do everything. So the new government was focused on getting the state to focus on the areas where it could do best, and then create space for the private sector to do the rest.
And then you start your career around about 1986. So some of these reforms had already started.
Yes.
And it would have started in terms of having a more market-based system. You had a fairly large agricultural sector, right? So you lost access to the common market when the UK joined the EU. So what were the kind of reform that was done basically in the agricultural sector? Because today, New Zealand farmers are some of the most highly productive farmers in the world. But I'm told that they were not so 40 years ago.
So in response to some of those changes in the global economy, the government had provided farmers with a lot of subsidies to increase production, subsidies for fertilizers, subsidies to transport their stock to be killed. So the agricultural sector received a lot of assistance. And so there were a set of incentives for farmers to just increase production. So in 1983, we had something like 70 million sheep, which is a lot for a country of then 3 million people. Today, there are around 30 million sheep.
So there was overproduction.
There was overproduction. But I think one of the things to remember in terms of those changes that the government made was it was very keen to, and I think one of the good features of that reform program is that it packaged reforms together. It explained how reforms connected. So yes, it removed essentially all the production subsidies that farmers had received. But on the other hand, it had devalued the exchange rate, which essentially supported the incomes going to exporters like farmers. It removed a lot of tariff barriers and tariff protection, which were felt most, the costs of which were felt most acutely by the export sector, particularly farmers. And so it explained that while there were particular measures that were hard on farmers, there were other parts of the reform package that were assisting, and more generally a sense that the importance for agriculture was to deliver and produce what consumers wanted. It wasn't just producing for the sake of it. It was producing the kinds of products that consumers wanted. So one of the very interesting things in agriculture in New Zealand, it's still very important, but it's changed hugely. So industries that were very small in the mid-1980s, like wine, are now very significant. Horticulture, apples, kiwi fruit, meat is produced in different ways for different markets. So that move from a production focus to a market focus led to a lot of innovation in terms of what was produced and how it was produced and how it was sold.
So in the 1980s, when you start your career, you started in the Treasury Department. And I believe that the Treasury was involved in the thought process about inflation targeting. New Zealand was the first country in the world to come up with inflation targeting. Can you share the narrative around how it happened?
So, as I explained, we'd had this long period of inflation that was high by the standards of most developed countries. So the government was very keen to move away from that high inflation period. One of the reasons why we'd had sustained high inflation was that decisions around interest rates, credit controls, etc., were taken quite actively by politicians rather than central bankers. And so one of the key principles of public sector reform generally, but particularly around central bank reform, was that politicians should set the overall objective, which in this case is price stability, and then the operational decisions about what's the level of interest rates that are needed to deliver that target would be taken by the central bank and the central bank alone, and that there would be accountability for the governor of the central bank around their performance in delivering inflation. The innovation, I think, came with both that clear separation of roles, but then to say, well, how should you define price stability? And therefore, and then how do you hold the governor to account? And that's where, in the end, we got to inflation being defined as being under 2% or around 2%. And it's been defined slightly differently at different times, but essentially it's kept at that over time. And so that sort of numerical target gave a degree of precision and clarity around the objective expressed at the political level, which then made it easier for the central bank then to operationalise that target and to be held to account for its performance.
So Iain, this had never been done in any other country. There was no precedent. How were the deliberations done? Was this the thought process of a few individuals, or were there a lot of back and forth discussion? How did you come up with this?
I think it was because the time was one of crisis, and there was a need for solutions that were, in a sense, out of the box, were different. It was a time where almost anything seemed possible. So it was a very liberating time for change. In terms of the central bank reform, there was a lot of engagement between the Treasury and obviously the Reserve Bank about how do you set up a new central bank act, what should be the key features, and there was quite a lot of active debate, including some quite strong disagreements at times. We brought in experts from overseas to advise and to share knowledge. One of the positive features about the government at the time is it also had a very active engagement and communication about its reform program. It was explaining what had happened in the past and why that was bad, why high inflation was bad, but also to explain why changes were being made, the nature of those changes, and being very active through many different channels over time to explain the change, to debate opponents. And so that there was a process there, and obviously with Central Bank Act that needed to go in front of the Parliament. And in the end, there was, I think from memory, there was no party that voted against the new Central Bank Act. And that was a reflection, I think, of both a desire to move away from the high inflation past, but also reflected both the quality of both the political engagement, but also the quality of the policy process that had been followed to come up with a new blueprint.
And in the governance structure of the central bank, can you talk a little bit about how you set it up? I mean, you have a board and who the representatives are. The Treasury Secretary sits on the board or is excluded?
So it is actually, it's changed over time. So originally when the Act was passed in 1989, in terms of monetary policy, the governor alone was responsible for making the decision on interest rates. And the idea with that was to have very clear accountability of around the person who made that decision. Over time, it's an interesting thing about how our institutions change. Because 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked by the Treasury to come back and review the central bank structure and how we made interest rates decisions. And one of the things that struck me was between 1989 and 2017, when I did the review, Many countries had gone to inflation targeting, but essentially all countries had gone to a form of monetary policy committee, like you have with the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank. And there is a lot of literature about why committees, if working well, can make better decisions on average than individuals. And that is why now, in following my review, the government changed the Reserve Bank Act, and so we now have a monetary policy committee which has 7 members, 4 from the central bank, which the governor chairs, and 3 external members. So we have moved from the single decision maker to the committee model, which is, I think, much more now in line with international good practice. And I think that reflects the way that, in a sense of reform is not static. You know, you don't just leap from where you were to nirvana. You've always got to be thinking about what are you learning from other countries? What have they got to share? How is the environment changing? And so that is why institutions need to keep evolving and improving over time.
So besides the Monetary Policy Committee, is there a separate governing board?
There is a governing board that looks at the overall management and operation and administration of the central bank as an organisation, and is responsible, if you like, for the organisational governance of the bank.
You mentioned that the government was communicating heavily with the public about the changes that needed to be done. So who was the chief communicator on all the economic reforms?
So at that time, the Minister of Finance was, if you like, the chief communicator. But there were a group of ministers who also had important portfolios in the reform process. So, for example, there was a minister for state-owned enterprises. There was a minister of trade who was responsible for essentially the tariff liberalisation program.
So quite literally,
and there was a group. So there was a group of ministers who were all aligned in terms of direction, but were individually leading on their individual levels and doing a lot of communication. So the government communications came across as quite united, but quite comprehensive.
So they were quite literally singing from the same hymn sheet.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes over here we find that they're all contradicting each other. So there was ideologically there was an alignment.
Well, there was the government that came in 1984 for its first several years had that alignment, and it was very successful. It was re-elected, in fact, at the next election. After that time, however, there were significant differences that arose largely over social policy, less actually over economic policy, which the government was unable to resolve internally successfully, and that meant that the government lost a lot of support and ultimately lost the next election.
I also note in your career that you were involved in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Was this also an innovation from New Zealand? And can you give us the background around how this came to be?
So in 1990, we had another election, and the government I talked about lost office, and it lost office to a centre-right government. And at that time, I was working for the Treasury, but I was actually seconded to the leader of the opposition's office as their economic advisor. And the day after the election, I was rung up by the Secretary of the Treasury to say that he needed to talk to the leader of the opposition, who was becoming the Prime Minister, urgently, because one of our major banks was about to fail. It was a state-owned bank. and it had got itself into trouble, and it needed to be recapitalised urgently. And so this is the day after the election. So I had to ring up the leader of the opposition, who obviously, because he won the election, had a big party, and probably didn't welcome my call early on the Sunday morning. And I had to say, well, you need to come back to Wellington because we have a problem. And after that, there was a process of essentially several days of very active working between the Treasury and the incoming government to work out what to do with this bank, which was ultimately recapitalised. Down the track, it was privatised. But because the incoming government then felt that its program was a bit derailed because it experienced this very unexpected fiscal shock. So part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act came out from their view about we don't want that to happen in future to another government. And so the Fiscal Responsibility Act was designed and at its heart was putting in place much greater transparency around the government's finances, including for the Treasury to issue a set of economic and fiscal forecasts a few weeks before the election, so that all the political parties could see the true situation before the election.
So you don't have an independent budget office?
No, we don't. We don't. Well, in part because in our system, the New Zealand Treasury, as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, has independence with respect to the assumptions it makes around economic projections and also tax revenue projections. So it has a degree of, if you like, statutory independence. So at the moment, we don't have a parliamentary budget office or an independent fiscal council, as many countries do. But there's that degree of independence around those projections.
So, so what was in the Responsibility Act? Did you put hard constraints? Or?
Because I mean, ultimately, different governments will have a different view around size of government. So we said the key thing though is having being explicit about your objectives, for example, around the fiscal surplus level of debt. There are a set of what are called principles of responsible fiscal management, which basically says that until you get to a prudent level of debt, which the government can specify, you need to be running surpluses. And after that, on average, you run a balanced budget. So in a sense of we have a set of quite clear principles, and then how they are operationalized and quantified is left to the government, but they must be explicit about that. And when their performance departs from their goals, and they have to explain why and how they're going to get back on track. So, for example, New Zealand, like many countries, ended up with COVID having to have a whole lot of spending programs that we hadn't expected. So that pushed us back off track. But then the government had to explain how it was going to return to the principles of responsible fiscal management over time. So that was the framework, together with the independence of the Treasury around those fiscal projections, regular fiscal and economic updates, regular reporting on the fiscal position, moving to accrual accounting and reporting using generally accepted accounting policies, so not policies set by the government, but independently. All those were sort of part of a package to make the public finances more credible and transparent.
So there are numerical constraints?
Governments do. So the current, for example, government has a goal of keeping debt to GDP below 30% of GDP. It has a commitment to have a surplus of, on average, 0 to 2% of GDP over time. Now, different governments will define those goals in slightly different ways, but the important thing is they do quantify them. But we didn't, if you like, hardwire a particular quantification into the Act, because we kind of recognise that over time circumstances would change and there would be different political preferences, and the Act had to acknowledge those changes.
So for the benefit of our viewers, just give us a sense of what your fisc looks like what's your revenue to GDP?
Our revenue to GDP currently is about 30%
30%.
of GDP, and our spending's roughly the same, and
your debt to GDP?
Our debt to GDP at the moment is around, our net debt to GDP is about just over 20% of GDP.
So the interest expense is a very small percentage of the total expense.
It is now. It is now. It was not in the mid-1980s when debt to GDP was about 50% of GDP, and interest rates were double digit, 15, 16%. Debt servicing was over 20% of total government spending. So it was very large. Now, debt servicing as a percentage of total government spending is about 3 or 4. It's gone up a bit in the last couple of years as debt's gone up a bit, and also interest rates have, but much lower than it was in the mid-1980s.
And is the central bank explicitly forbidden from monetary financing?
Not in the Act, but the decisions about how it finances are left totally with the central bank. It cannot be directed by the minister, and no minister has sought to do that, and the central bank has not sought to have monetary financing. So that's not really ever been an issue in New Zealand.
I also noted that in your career, you worked on taxation. You said revenue to GDP is about 30%, of which I believe majority of that would be tax revenue.
Yes.
So can you give a sense of how New Zealand thinks about taxation and how its tax structure works?
So prior to the changes in the mid-1980s, our tax system was quite narrow. We raised most of our taxes through income tax. There were a lot of loopholes in the tax system that tended to favour high income, wealthy people. Tax rates were high at their peak. Our highest income tax rate was 60%. So one of the shifts from the mid-1980s onwards, which has largely been kept, is to move to what we call low rate broad base. So the idea that you broaden the tax space, you remove a lot of those loopholes.
So these loopholes were in the form of deduction?
They were all tax expenditures, so you could deduct expenditures on private health insurance, about buying certain bits of land or certain business activities. So there was a whole range of loopholes, and so as part of the packaging of change, the government closed a lot of those loopholes. It brought down the top, brought down a whole series of income tax rates to much lower levels, into the sort of at their height, the sort of high 30s rather than 60%. Broadened tax base. We introduced we call it GST, you call it VAT, which started out at 10%, but again very broad based. We have no significant exemptions around our GST.
And it's a flat rate.
It's a flat rate of 15%, and across the vast majority of goods and services.
Do you remember how much you collect as a proportion of GDP? from GST if the rate is about 15%?
It's roughly about I think 8% of GDP.
Okay, it's a large amount.
So yes, so it's more balanced. I mean, income tax and obviously corporate tax, but GST is
Do you exempt things like food or even?
No, I mean, interesting enough that we've just had an election in New Zealand, and the government who actually lost the election, they campaigned on removing GST from fruit and vegetables, and they designed it as a measure of relief from cost of living pressures. But interestingly enough, people were very skeptical about this change. They pointed out, it wouldn't deliver very much. Would make the system much more complex, and so it didn't really, generate a lot of enthusiasm. And so, I think that shows the benefit of a good design of taxes that are broad and allow you to have a lower rate than a complex system with multiple and potentially quite high rates.
I noted in your career, one area you worked on is microeconomic policy related to taxation. Now, what happens in Sri Lanka is because we have so many exemptions, there's so much of distortions in relative prices. Did you have to think about these relative prices in your work in the tax policy unit?
Yes, and the principle was essentially tax should not really drive investment decisions, and investment decisions should be driven by the economic merits of a particular investment. And so a lot of the philosophy about broad-based lower rates, getting rid of a lot of exemptions, was to reduce the extent to which tax was motivating behavior. The one area where we haven't closed that off, like many countries, is where it comes to investment in housing. Both residential housing and buying housing for investment purposes, and that area is relatively tax favored because we don't have a comprehensive capital gains tax.
So you have negative gearing.
No, we don't have negative gearing, but because we don't have a capital gains tax.
Or you don't have any gains tax.
Well, we have for particularly when in certain kinds of financial assets, but not where it comes to housing, whether it's residential or investment. So that is
And your marginal tax rate is?
The top marginal tax rate at the moment is 39 cents in the dollar, and that is for incomes over 180,000 New Zealand dollars, which is roughly, in terms of USD, with 100,000 US dollars.
So the high income earners probably invest in property and mortgage it and use it as a tax shield because you can deduct the interest income from your taxes or interest expense.
No, you can't. You can't deduct your income deductibility has been removed, but to the extent that you have a property and then you sell it, you're not going to be taxed on the capital gain. So, and this remains an area of quite live political debate in New Zealand about should there be a capital gains tax? If so, what should it cover? And there's quite a lot of debate around it. I mean, at the moment, both the major political parties have said that they are not moving on capital gains tax. But I think there's still quite a lot of conversation about whether that's a good thing for New Zealand, and I expect that debate to continue.
And what is the compliance rates on taxation? Pretty much all, is your tax net very wide, or do you have evasion?
Well, every tax system has evasion. So there are several responses to that. One is, in moving to low rate broad base, you reduce some of the incentives to evade tax because you don't have those very high rates. It also means that the tax system is perceived as fairer across groups in society. So that's one response. Our tax department puts a lot of effort around education, because some people who don't pay tax, it's not necessarily because they want to evade. It's they don't understand the tax law, or they get something wrong. So there's a lot of education to improve compliance. There is quite a strong auditing function. We for every extra dollar we spend on tax audits, we get in about $7 of additional revenue. So tax auditing is important, and focusing on those areas of the tax system where evasion is going to be more widespread. So those areas which are more likely to be cash-based, for example. And the other response has been over the last decade, there's been a significant digitization and automation of the tax system. So there's more withholding at source. It's easier compliance. Many New Zealanders with straightforward tax systems now don't have to make a tax return. It's because their tax is correctly withheld at source. So it's all fine, and that helps compliance as well. So there's a series of initiatives that have been taken to improve compliance. But like I say, every country has tax evasion.
And how many tax brackets do you have? The highest rate is 39. But how many brackets?
We have currently 5.
Right. And the lowest rate is at what?
Lowest rate is 17.
And your corporate tax rate is what?
Our corporate tax rate is 28.
Since you worked in tax policy area, did you ever analyze what the US does about earned income tax credit? Whether you ever thought about introducing that in New Zealand?
We have some forms of we have a scheme that's called Working for Families. So that for families in work, they get a targeted cash payment per child, which is dependent upon their income level. So it's not for everyone. It's targeted, and it abates over a period of time. And so that has been introduced to support people to stay in work as opposed to go on benefit. Acknowledges the costs that come with raising families, but it's also targeted, so it abates as people go through the income scale.
If I can move on to trade reform, I mean, New Zealand is a small country in the South Pacific, but you have a very liberal orientation towards trade. And it was not so during the 1970s, no. And you touched on it, that you reformed the economy. So what kind of trade system do you have now?
So as you say, New Zealand went from essentially the late 1930s to the middle of the 1980s. We had one of the most protected trade systems in the developed world. So we had both very high levels of tariff protection, and we had a lot of quantitative restrictions, quotas. And we did crazy things. We incentivized car manufacturers in Japan who made a car to dismantle the car in Japan, put it into a box, send it to New Zealand, and then reassemble the car in a factory in New Zealand, which meant the cars were very expensive.
I just wanted to interrupt you. You said it's a crazy thing. We are doing that here in Sri Lanka.
So essentially, we moved from And that came from a view that, we needed to protect industries so they could get a critical mass and they could be competitive, the so-called infant industry argument. But by the mid-1980s, many of these industries weren't infants anymore, and they weren't successfully export-oriented. They were still largely domestically focused. So as a small country, as you say, we felt it was much more important for New Zealand overall to be competitive, which meant that we had to reduce markedly our tariff protection, our import protection, which we've done over the last few decades, both unilaterally to start with, where we reduced many of the very high levels of protection, got rid of quantitative controls, and over the last 20 years or so, successive New Zealand governments have really promoted trade agreements with a number of partners, both bilaterally and regionally, and in the context of those agreements has been further tariff liberalisation. So now that for the vast bulk of goods and services, there's either zero or very low tariffs in place.
So you could quite literally buy a Ferrari in New Zealand and pay only the GST, is it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when this liberalization happened, many industries or many companies would have gone down, but some would have changed and prospered. The white goods brand Fisher and Paykel was a company that survived. I mean, if you were making white goods mainly for the New Zealand market, you wouldn't have survived versus all the large brands in the world. But this company survived, right? Until recently, it got taken over by Haier. How do you know anything about how they survived?
They survived because they successfully adapted, to the changed environment. They reduced their cost structure. They rationalized their product. They made their machines much more efficient. They changed the product selection. They did many things over time. I mean, they started out with good, sound, reliable machines, which is important, and then they innovated. They also had a growing industry. They moved into healthcare products, and particularly incubators, and they're separated. In fact, it became so significant they separated into a new company called Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, which is still listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange, and that very well through COVID, because the incubators were used in hospitals for COVID patients internationally, and so that showed you that there were clearly some industries that were always going to struggle. So we used to make shoes in New Zealand, and that really was never going to be able to be competitive with Asian manufacturers of shoes. But for some of these more advanced manufacturing, some of these firms, adapted and adjusted to the contemporary world. A little bit like my example about agriculture. Yes, there were some parts of agriculture that contracted, but new forms of agriculture or adaptation occurred. So there were a whole series of quite different adjustments.
Moving on, a significant part of your career was also in the public service, and you were involved in public service reform. Can you speak a little bit about that experience?
So after a while, as you said, I worked very much in the economic space, but I grew increasingly interested around public sector delivery and why there seemed to be consistent problems about government being able to deliver, or agencies not being able to deliver what government wanted, or issues about accountability. So I moved from the Treasury into called a State Services Commission, which was the sort of civil service department in New Zealand. And I was head of the civil service for 8 years, from 2008 until 2016. And during that time, I actually started my role just a couple of months before the global financial crisis. And after that crisis, a new government came in, and they didn't have a lot of money. In fact, they had to save money. But they also wanted to demonstrate that they could deliver good quality public services for both substantive reasons, but also political reasons. So the challenge they gave me was, well, how do you get more efficiency and effectiveness, but no more money? And so that was a lot of my time as head of the civil service was thinking through different ways in which we could achieve that.
So can you give some examples of value for money things that you did?
So one of the things that became very clear was many ministries didn't know what the priorities were. And if you're not clear with a ministry what the priorities are, it's not surprising if they don't deliver what the government wants. So one of the things we introduced with the support of the government was what was called the Better Public Services Targets. So the government took a set of issues that were very important to the government. So some of them were in the health area, that wanted to increase the percentage of children that were vaccinated, for example. It wanted to increase the number of public services that were digitized and were available digitally to the community. It wanted to make improvements in qualifications that New Zealanders were getting in the education system. So there were 10 areas. So it chose a reasonably focused area. And there was a minister who was required to be accountable to lead in each area. And as head of civil service, I appointed a head of ministry, or chief executive as we call them, to also be accountable. And we reported to Cabinet on progress in a very frank report every 6 months with a traffic light system. Green, everything's going okay, red, significant issues. And those reports were published. And so over time, we got big shifts in performance. And that came from both the clarity about priority, the clarity about accountability, both at the minister level, but also at the official level, and also the regular reporting and accountability. So it was an issue that was always very important for the ministries that had those key priorities, and so we were able to shift performance probably faster and more significantly than even I thought. I'm generally an optimist about these things. So that's just an example. There were other areas where we looked to change the way in which we procured key services. So instead of having individual ministries having their own Microsoft licenses, we aggregated the demand, and we got a better price from Microsoft for services. So a range of different approaches, but we're all trying to either improve the effectiveness of policy, but also efficiency. One of the ones I think is quite important was we tried to use data much more intelligently, because government ministries in every country hold a lot of data, and we started to put data together to tell pictures about and stories about journeys of people in the community and how you might want to change them. So one of the things we found out was if a young woman in New Zealand under the age of 20 had a child, over around 20 years, the taxpayer would pay that woman about $2 million. And it was through a whole series of things that might happen to that woman and the child through that time. And so out of that came this approach called social investment, which the idea being investment is by knowing that actually there's a cost, maybe $2 million to use the example, the state can invest in things like at the front end, at that time that young woman is maybe vulnerable, around training, support, to get a different outcome. And that's good for the individual, but it's good for the taxpayer over time.
What I have seen here, Iain, is that government departments who have a lot of data, they're very territorial. They don't want to share it. Did you have a similar experience
Yes.
in New Zealand?
I think one of the things is yes, data was held, and sometimes for good reason. People were worried about sharing data. Some of it was territorial, some of it was held in different forms. So one of the things we did was get our statistical authority, which has quite a degree of independence, to put together an anonymized data set, which now has about, I think, 1.66 billion individual pieces of information. So that allowed the government agencies to share that information in a way that became anonymized, but would allow these kind of stories and journeys to be visible. And that was an important part of the cultural shift around data.
You've been a civil servant all your life. How is the New Zealand civil service organized? And what is the nexus between the civil service and the politicians? Is it completely ring-fenced to be completely independent, or you have a healthy relationship with the politicians? How does that dynamic work?
So for many decades in New Zealand, there's been a reasonably clear separation between political leadership, that being ministers who are responsible for policy, direction, political management, and administrative leadership, the civil service, in terms of having responsibility for the management of departments, the hiring of staff. So for a long time, there's been that understanding of the separation of roles, which I think brings a clarity to accountability. But at the same time, recognition is the civil service is there to serve the government of the day, to work with them in their program and to deliver their program. And that means that civil service ministers can't sit apart. They need to work together, but they have different roles, kind of complementary roles. And in most cases, that works well. There are issues from time to time about where there are conflicts or issues where relationships don't work, and as head of civil service, that's a part of your job about trying to resolve those issues if they arise. But in general, I think there's an understanding across the political parties about those differences of roles, but also the value in a professional civil service that is able to serve whoever is the government of the day.
When Britain left Sri Lanka, they left us an extremely good civil service. Unfortunately, that's not so because of the political changes that have happened. It was very prestigious to join the civil service, and it was meritocratic, and the top people in a graduating class joined the civil service. Does that hold in New Zealand?
I think civil services is an attractive place for many people to come. They come in, they have long careers. You have many people who have other family members who their parents have worked in civil service. I think most public servants in New Zealand are proud to be public servants. I think this is like public services globally. In New Zealand, we need to keep adapting to change because people want different experiences now from the workplace. And I think the challenge for our public service, as it is elsewhere, is to keep evolving to make sure that public service is motivating and attractive for smart people for many decades to come.
And are they compensated competitively?
I think in general, public service salaries are what I call reasonable. You know, they don't match the heights of the highest roles in the private sector, no, but they are generally at a reasonable level. The and to that is because I think there's a clear focus in most agencies about their role in serving the public, is that most public servants enjoy being public servants, not necessarily because of the money, sort of okay, but it's because they get to make a difference, whatever that difference is. And I think that's a really important part of having a public service that's oriented on its purpose in serving the public.
So when you reflect back on your career, what was the most gratifying experiences that you had serving in the public service?
I think the experiences that I had that were great were those experiences of reform. Was actually taking something from where it had been, designing and then implementing and embedding a change which, you know, was sustained. I mean, for me, that's very satisfying because, as I said earlier, you know, public services are never static. You know, to stay relevant, to be trusted, there has to be change. And so to be a part in my career where I had experiences of being part of several change processes is a fantastic experience to have had.
And what specific skill did you bring to the process?
I think apart from my technical skills as an economist, I think I've always been interested about how things fit together. You know, I've been always interested in systems. I did, like I said, I did economics at university, but I also did history. And for me, one of the things I like about history is that it combines a whole lot of influences together. So I hope that in terms of working with people, that part of what I have been able to bring to the table is a sense about how you can see a system that is different, and how you can connect different individual parts that help to explain and to motivate change.
Iain, my last topic that I want to explore with you is, I've been fascinated about your country. You have 5 million people. You're in the Southwest Pacific or South Pacific. You punch way above your weight class. I mean, we know about your All Blacks. They have been dominating. I'm sorry that you lost the other day. But in many other fields, I remember in high school studying about Rutherford, who I believe was a New Zealand,
Yes.
who was a chemist, right?
Yes.
Who was the electrons. Yeah.
Yes.
You have Kerry Tekanava, who was a world-class soprano, and maybe a few other names. The names don't come to mind immediately. Is it the water?
I think you know, one of the things about growing up in a small country is having that sense of possibility. You know, you're not one of 50 million or 100 million or 1 billion. That there's still a uniqueness about people and where they live, and I think because there are so many stories, you know, whether they are for people who succeed at the world level or people who just do well in terms of a trade or a profession, and they can see that, you know, there's a sense for many people in New Zealand about being able to create that experience themselves. You know, for example, now in New Zealand, you know, 30% nearly of New Zealanders were born outside New Zealand. So you say, why are people who are now increasingly Indians and Filipinos and Chinese, South Africans and British coming to New Zealand? It's because they see for themselves that capacity to have a different life and to achieve and be fulfilled in whatever way they want to. And that's something I think, you know, I think is being delivered for many New Zealanders. We have to keep working very hard to keep those senses of opportunity, because they're not there for everyone, and we have to keep working hard on that. But I think I'd say, you know, there's an advantage about living in a country that has been relatively new in terms of, if you like, human inhabitants, and also is relatively small. There's that sense of possibility and optimism, and I hope that continues for, you know, my children going into the future.
And finally, what brought you to Sri Lanka?
Well, I mean, I've followed your country and the challenges that you've had over the past year, and I was very when the New Zealand High Commission raised the possibility of coming here and talking to people and maybe sharing some of our experiences, I leapt at the opportunity.
You hadn't been here before?
No, I hadn't. So for me, it just seemed a place I'd always wanted to be, and having the opportunity to talk about reform and change, it was a very easy invitation to say yes to.
Okay. Iain Rennie, thank you very much to have visited us in Sri Lanka and for the fascinating conversation with me.
Thank you.